So today we're going to be covering 2 chapters as well as a number of readings. These are chapters I have less to say about, and in various ways I'm going to use them as springboards to talk about sorta related topics. At least that's the plan. We'll see how much we get through. So the last topic we covered before test number 1, and by the way, how'd everyone find the test? Mixed response. So, I mean, look, it's a little different than what you might be used to in psychology, right? So it's all written, but you should now have a good idea of what to expect, right? So the test may be hard in some ways, but they're at least transparent. There should not have really been any surprises. So if you did well, and many people did do very well, just keep doing what you're doing. If there's room for improvement, I'm here to help. I'm happy to answer questions about any of the bits of material. So the other tests will all have that same format. So my number 1 tip, as always, is to test yourself on the key terms. That's the bulk of the test. And then for the written, you know what's coming in advance, and you're welcome, of course, to ask questions about those concepts as well. So it should be clear what your next steps are if you want to improve. But as I was going to say, last class, the topic we covered was psychological egoism, which is the idea that the only real human motivation is selfishness. All of our actions are in some way caused by selfish desires, and both the book and the readings were pretty militantly against that view. Having said that, look, obviously selfishness is a human motivation, and a very important one. No one would deny that. And chapter 4 is in part about the extent to which there are sort of self-interested reasons to be moral. So even if we say, okay, we're not going to go with the egoist and say selfishness is the only motivation, it certainly is a human motivation. Are there any self-interested reasons to be nice? Is really the core of chapter 4. A lot of it talks about some of the ancient Greek philosophers, and probably these names you've heard many times, but it's worth reviewing kind of the big guns. So often in a history of philosophy course, the first 3 names you learn are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Have any of you seen Princess Bride? Great movie, so there should be more hands. But I saw it when I was like 8 or 9. My family and I, we were vacationing somewhere, and it was just me and my brother, and my parents saw that it was playing on TV, and they're like, oh, you guys have to see this. And we were like, well, Princess Bride, this sounds like a girl's movie, or whatever. And then when we watched it, we were like, oh, we could not have been more wrong. That movie's for everybody. There's a scene that the names always make me think of, where there's the smart bad guy, and the good guy is having a battle of wits with the smart bad guy. And they're kind of saying, how smart are you? And the smart bad guy is like, let me put it this way. You ever heard of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates? Fools. That's what I was thinking when I think of these guys. But so Socrates, there were philosophers before Socrates who were called the pre-Socratic philosophers, but a lot of histories of Western philosophy start with him. So the story goes, and the story is probably exaggerated, but the story goes that he goes to see the oracle at Delphi. Does anyone know, what does the oracle at Delphi tell him? Anybody know? So the oracle tells him, you are the wisest man in Athens. So you're the smartest person in these parts. And Socrates thinks to himself, well, I'm not that wise, I'm pretty average. And what he reasons from that is, well, I must be wise because I know that I don't know. That's what separates me from the other philosophers of the city, is I am aware of my own ignorance. And so what he did was go around and argue with the philosophers of the city. And really all he did was just ask them questions. And through asking the right sorts of questions, he was able to show they didn't know what they thought they knew. And so they killed him. Happens. I mean, if we're being technical, they forced him to commit suicide, but close enough. So the core, though, from that story of Socrates, his reasoning, his view of how we should reason is in line with skepticism, right? Asking questions, engaging in critical thinking. His student Plato, in some ways, is maybe a departure from from Socrates, especially towards the end of his life. Plato had a very rigid, well-defined metaphysical view of the world. A philosopher I like named Karl Popper basically said that Plato is to Socrates what Judas was to Jesus. That was one summary of Popper's book. Now, that's maybe a bit extreme, but there's crucial differences. Now, having said that, a lot of what we know about what Socrates said actually comes from Plato. Socrates left no surviving writings. Plato wanted to be a playwright. That's what he originally trained as, but he decided to do philosophy instead. And what's the nature of Plato's books? Have you read many of? They're always dialogues, so they're sort of like plays. And the main character in the stories is always Socrates, and it's just stories of Socrates arguing with people. Now, especially in Plato's later writings, it's generally thought that, he's just using the character Socrates as a mouthpiece for what Plato really thinks. So the example that, just to complete the picture, so then Aristotle is Plato's student, so that's the order in which it goes. Aristotle much more empirically oriented than Plato was. So Plato thought you could discover what's true just by sitting down and thinking really hard about it, but Aristotle was more of a proto-scientist, right? Emphasized more empirical observation. So these names will come up in the chapter, but that's the kind of brief, overly simplified history of them. Plato's most famous book, The Republic, which is talked about in this chapter, so there's a number of debates he has there between Socrates and other characters. One of them that our textbook talks about is the debate between Socrates and Glaucon, where Glaucon is sort of gesturing at something like psychological egoism. Glaucon tells this story of the ring of Gyges, which is it's a kind of thought experiment designed to make us think about separating ourselves from the consequences of our actions. So it's a ring that makes you invisible, so therefore you're not, never get caught doing anything wrong. And what Glaucon says is, well, obviously, anyone who had that ring would do lots of terrible things, would steal and murder and assault people, because there's no consequences. I mean, to get away with it, you probably have to make the ring do more than just make you invisible. But the idea is, if there were never any consequences to bad actions, wouldn't we all just do bad things all the time? And really, the whole point of the Republic is, at least a very central part of it, is arguing against that idea. But that's what the Ring of Gyges example is about. So to what extent is that true? To what extent is it true that, if there were no bad consequences for our actions, would we engage in bad behavior? And, part of the point of the prior chapter in egoism was to argue that, no, it's not, that's only true if our only motivations are selfish. There's no eraser. The chapter makes a very important distinction between moral reasons and prudential reasons. And by reasons here, I mean reasons for action, right? So we sometimes speak in ordinary language of, so-and-so has a reason to do X. These are two different senses of that term, two different ways in which we can have reasons for doing something. And you can probably guess at roughly what the distinction is, even if you haven't read the chapter. A prudential reason is a self-interested reason. So if I say to you, you have a reason to eat vegetables, namely, they're healthy, I'm not saying you're being naughty if you don't eat vegetables. I'm saying this is in your interest, right? If you do this, it will benefit you. If I say you shouldn't punch Jim in the face because it will cause him pain, that would be a moral reason. Right? His pain, the pain you're going to cause him, is an example of a moral reason. This chapter is mainly about the second one, or maybe more to the point, ways in which these two can overlap. And the question the chapter is really asking is, do we have prudential reasons for being moral? Are there self-interested reasons why it actually is a good idea to be nice to people and so on? Well, to answer that, one thing we have to decide on is, what is in our own interest? What is it that's good for us? If we just temporarily leave morality aside and just think, what's in my interest, what's good for me? If we answer that, then we can answer to what extent we have prudential reasons for being nice. One influential theory of what's in people's best interest is hedonism, which we already have talked about in prior chapters. Hedonism is the view that what's in your interest is whatever causes you the most pleasure, the most good feels. An early defender of this in ancient Greece was Epicurus. And it's funny, both at the time and now, many people strawman Epicurus as being, because you hear, okay, this guy thinks that pleasure is all that's good, and people at the time said, oh, those Epicureans, all they care about is like sex, drugs, rock and roll. I mean, they wouldn't have said it like that, but there's a certain image you get of a hedonist, which is in fact not accurate of him, but yes?
When you're referring to hedonism in terms of pleasure, is it just physical pleasure, or is it also emotional or cognitive pleasure?
Yeah, so someone like Epicurus and most hedonists are going to say it's defined broadly as any positive mental state. So any mental state that's pleasant to experience. So it could include the pleasure of reading a book, the pleasure of a nice walk, but it has to be consciously felt. And in fact, and this may be surprising to hear, the more raw physical pleasures like food, sex, and certain substances, Epicurus was very skeptical of. He thought they were more trouble than they were worth, and thought that the best way to have maximum pleasure is to have a kind of peaceful, contemplative life. Now, in a way, that's actually more of an empirical question. Which types of behaviors do in fact produce, more net pleasure over pain? But that was what he thought would give you the most pleasure. So this idea has some initial plausibility, but one of the most famous objections to this, the chapter has a discussion of this, and this will be our first discussion topic of the day, is the experience machine. This comes from the philosopher Robert Nozick. So this is an objection to hedonism. Here's the way it works. Suppose, and it's increasingly easier to imagine this kind of thing. I mean, we're still not close to this, but given future advancements in technology, who knows, maybe we could make something like this. This is a machine that gives you any experience you want. And you can, wipe your memory before you go in, at least your memory of choosing to go in, so you'll believe it's real. And you might think, well, I wouldn't program in just pleasure all the time, because maybe there are some kinds of pleasure that you can't get unless you also have some difficulty, maybe like the joy of achievement, or the feeling you get after a good workout. So whatever, maybe you program in some suffering to increase future pleasures, but the point is, any conscious experience you want to have, the experience of dating Rihanna, the experience of getting to the top of Everest, whatever you want, you can program in. But it won't correspond to anything real, right? Your friends in this machine are just, digits of code in the program that is, feeding to you. So none of your experiences are real, but they'll seem perfectly real while you're in the machine. So the question is, do we want to step into the experience machine? Do we want to live, or even your whole life, in the experience machine? If you're a hedonist, it seems like you have to say yes. Now maybe, and this will be, I would say, our first discussion topic, maybe you probably do some pretty heavy modifications to hedonism, but at the very least, it seems like if hedonism is true, it would be in your self-interest to go into the experience machine. Based on my description, show of hands, who would think it's good to step into the experience machine? So maybe 4 or so. So usually it's a minority. First discussion topic. Why not for those of you who said no, and why yes for those of you who said yes? What do we think about the experience machine? And we'll make this one the submission topic, so you can write a few sentences for Blackboard. Yep.
Sorry, the thing you guys said or not, I just need to clarify. You're aware that nothing is real, right?
No. So you can wipe your memory before, you will fully believe that it's real once you step in. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to get out of it later, or you will stay there forever?
Well, so that's the thing. You can discuss both possibilities. I think if you're a straightforward hedonist, you're probably going to have to say it's better to step in for your whole life, because you're going to get more good feels there than you would here, because you can program it exactly how you want. Yep.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand.
Yep.
So the experience machine is you wipe your memory.
At least your memory of deciding to go into it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so like you wouldn't have known that you decided to do that.
Yeah.
And it's basically any experience that's good.
Yep.
And then you could choose to not be in that forever, or you would need to decide that.
I suppose you have to decide that at the beginning. And you can discuss different options there. Like maybe you say, I'll take it if I only have to go in for a bit. Although I think even if you take the option of, I want to spend a year in the experience machine but then leave, even that would be a problem for hedonism, because you're saying there are some things other than pleasure that I care about. So, anyway, these are all good considerations to banter with your group. So, as usual, 2, 3 to 5-ish people. Okay, so what are some thoughts that different groups had about this topic? Yep.
I had a question actually.
Yep, of course.
In this theoretical experience machine, would you be able to program some kind of thing that would bypass like a adaptation of dopamine responses that would keep you after a while?
That's a good question. I think you're going to have to say yes.
Yes.
Because it's meant to be a challenge to hedonism, and it's supposed to be like a thought experiment. So yeah, as you rightly note, in our actual brains, we adapt to excessive dopamine release. So presumably, we'll just say yes. This is a magical machine that God made, so it can overcome that kind of adaptation.
And just to answer the question briefly, to me it's like kind of the whole plot of the Matrix, I guess.
Yes.
And the mere fact that it's not real, I have a problem with that, and I'd rather live a life where there's challenges and difficulties mixed in with pleasure and hedonism.
So there's 2 issues. So one is, so if you haven't seen The Matrix, everyone is living in something like an experience machine. But in the real world, AI has taken over and the world is kind of a hellscape. And when you watch the movie, you do have the sense that, yeah, it's right to leave the fantasy world, even though the real world is less pleasant. Although I will say, for the challenges part, you can program that in, and you'll believe it's a real challenge, but it's just digits of code that your earlier self programmed in. But yeah.
Oh, okay, well that actually changes what
Oh, okay.
I was gonna say, because I actually agree
Yeah.
that like, we don't grow without challenges. We can't progress our cognitive abilities without challenges.
Yep.
So why would I want to be in a place where I only feel pleasure? Like, I'm never going to get the benefit of experiencing resilience or courage or vulnerability.
So yeah, so you can program that in, but the key thing that I guess, and some people I heard say is missing is, yeah, but it's not real. Like, I want my struggles and so on to correspond to something real. Yeah.
And also, maybe this is the point of the thought experiment. It seems profoundly selfish.
Yes.
Because
So
you're leaving, you might be leaving family behind.
yep.
People
So
don't care about you, right? So,
good. So one issue. So there's two questions. One is what's in your interest, and one thing you can say is, fine, maybe it's in my interest. Maybe I'm a hedonist in that sense, but there are things I care about other than my own interests. I care about being around for my family and so on. One thing you could say to make it juicier is, okay, what if everyone has the option of being in the experience machine? And then it removes the moral dilemma. Then it's just purely a matter of, is it in our interest to be in the machine or not? Any other thoughts? Okay, here's a kind of part two. So I will say, I think this is a very powerful thought experiment that eats at least for most people, the intuition that pleasure is all that matters. I forget who, but there was another philosopher who came up with an interesting response, which is the reverse experience machine. You gotta love philosophers. And this, I think, shows that at least part of our aversion to the experience machine is actually status quo bias. So here's the way the reverse experience machine works. And actually, I guess it connects with the matrix in a way. Suppose that someone, wakes you up, and it turns out your whole life has been in the experience machine up to now. And all the friends and so on that you thought you had are actually just letters of code or whatever. And if you step out of the experience machine your whole life has been in so far, you will live an interesting, pleasurable life in the real world. So, show of hands, who wants to step out of the experience machine? So maybe half of the class, and that's consistent with studies. So some percentage of people want to stay here whether or not it's real. So at least part of the initial aversion to the experience machine is just wanting to stick with what's familiar, not really related to hedonism versus not. Although it's not all of the effect, but at least some of the effect is that. So there's an interesting, footnote to the experience machine.
What happened if an experience machine, I love someone, but this person loves another person? How this going to work?
Wait, I'm confused. Wait, so
My pleasure is to love someone.
Which
And
version
to,
is this?
Experience machine.
The top one.
And to receive the love back, right? But
Yep.
this person, it's in love with another one. How can I have the good experience? How can I
So
get my desire?
just to make sure I know what you're saying. So you love someone, they love you.
No.
Oh, they don't love you.
No, yes, another person. And how can I receive the pleasure that I want?
I think it's that the experience machine is an individual thing. Even if multiple people are in the experience machine, you're not in the same reality.
Yes, so if that's answering your question. So each person, you get your own little machine. You're in there, you experience everything. There's no real people in there. It's all just computer simulations of people. So any experience of love you have is a kind of hallucination. It's for...
Always, okay.
Yeah.
Everything is like...
It's always...
It's all tailored for you.
It's all tailored for you. Yeah. Yep.
At all.
This is probably like going beyond the scope of the question. But if you were to have this like all society opt to enter the experience machine, what would that mean for our civilization? Like it's probably not a good thing because who's going to be doing the real work to keep these machines running?
Yeah, I mean that's so. Now, of course, philosophers have the annoying answer. We'll just pretend we have really cool AIs that do all the maintenance for us or whatever. Now, in reality, of course, yeah, you would probably need people around to keep the machines running and so on. But what I think the thought experiment helps with is, what do we really care about? If hypothetically this was all on offer, and I think even if we make it perfect and therefore very unrealistic, I think many people still feel like, no, I wouldn't want to step in there because I care about my experiences corresponding with something real, with real people, and so on.
I have one question.
Yeah, of course.
If there is really this kind of machine, how can you be sure about your current status is not in another machine?
Well, the philosopher's answer is going to be you can't be sure, of course.
Yeah, then it doesn't matter from one machine to another machine, right? Why people care so much about reality?
You're getting into simulation theory now.
Yeah, I guess so. So maybe I'll just hold off on that. And we covered some of that in 3309. I'll just say it's an interesting question. Now, of course, hedonism is not the only view on offer. Another view of what well-being is, and again, we're for now just asking what's in people's self-interest. We're temporarily leaving aside moral questions, although we may then ask, is it in our self-interest to be moral as well? Is there overlap? But another view is desire satisfaction. That what's in your best interest is to satisfy your desires. This could include pleasure, so if you want to feel pleasure, then feeling pleasure counts as well-being. But, so I guess the one-sentence definition, desire satisfaction means well-being consists of getting what you want, even if what you want doesn't make you happier or feel more pleasure. So if you want to win the Nobel Prize, winning the Nobel Prize is part of well-being or part of your self-interest. Even if getting it, you don't really feel the buzz. Yep.
Is this still part of the prudential reasoning?
Yeah, good. So these are all, and then the next one we're going to see is eudaimonia. These are three different accounts of what is in our own interest. Three different accounts of what counts as prudence or self-interest. So again, for desire satisfaction, that's the idea that what's in our interest is getting what we want, even if what we want doesn't give us the buzz or the good feels. And then the last one, which is associated with Aristotle, is eudaimonia. If you read the Nicomachean Ethics, which is Aristotle's main work on ethics and value, he says that what everyone really wants is, now it's usually translated as happiness, which is a little bit misleading. So what the Greek word is eudaimonia. Eu means good. And it's kind of a dark example, but it's actually where we get the word eugenics. Eugenics means good genes. So that's kind of a dark example. But and then daimon's kind of weird. It's actually the root word for like demon. So it means like good spirit or good. At least that's the etymology. Now, what it means is something closer to flourishing or having a good life. The connection with spirit is actually maybe misleading, but that's more just an etymology fun fact. So, I mean, one interesting quote from Aristotle is, you can't tell if someone has real happiness until you see their grandchildren. Now, if you mean, that can't be hedonism. right? So it means, is your life flourishing? Are you having a successful, well-lived life in accordance with your function? And I said the word function, so function is an important part of this idea. Aristotle had what philosophers call a teleological view of the world, in which objects and animals have purposes or functions. So this is pre-Darwin, of course. I mean, there's still a notion of function in evolution, but it's quite different. So in the case of humans, well, actually, forget humans. You know, we wouldn't say that an axe has happiness or eudaimonia, but if we did, we would say it has that if it's good at doing what it's supposed to do. It's good at cutting things. So for humans, Aristotle thought some of our main functions were being reasoning creatures and being social creatures. So a big part of a eudaimonic life is engaging in reasoning and having social relationships. Yep.
So this is I got this from one of my philosophy classes way back in Douglas College, but isn't the daimon connection because the ancient Greeks used to believe that we used to have spirits on our shoulder, and it was something about being, I don't remember the other part of it, but wasn't there an actual explanation for it?
Maybe. Yeah, I don't remember the shoulder thing, but that's plausible. So there could be a way of making a connection that's better than what I did.
Okay.
Perhaps. I think I saw another hand. No, we're all good. Okay, so a question we can then ask is, okay, whichever view of well-being we have, does morality contribute to our own well-being? Does being a good or nice person facilitate more well-being? And the book has a nice discussion of actually our first article for the day, which is Laura Aknin's research. Aknin did her PhD at UBC, and she works now at SFU, so we have a little bit of BC pride. And she tried to answer empirically, with a really nice cross-cultural study, to what extent does moral behavior increase well-being? So I won't go into all the details, although if you want to I'll give the general summary of the results. But one thing I'll say, with empirical articles like the Aknin reading, it's worth seeing if you find the results interesting, because remember, at the end of the course, one of the things you have to do is a research proposal, and you have to summarize at least 2 of the readings in the kind of background section of the research proposal. So always keep in mind, is this the kind of article I might want to build on or make a proposal in the same area. So first, what Aknin did was just look for correlational evidence. So of course, we're all taught in intro that correlation does not imply causation, but correlational evidence is often step 1, right? Seeing if there's something going on here, and then you do experiments to see if the connection is causal. So the first study looked at survey results from 136 countries. So in psychology, we are, of course, always worried about the weird problem, right? The fact that many samples are from Western countries, but this is a really nice cross-cultural sample. And found that pro-social spending, so how much you give to charity per year, is associated with more reported well-being. Okay, then of course we want to do an experiment to see if there's a causal connection. She had, now this is a smaller sample, but still cross-cultural. Canada, Uganda, and India got samples and randomly assigned them to multiple conditions. where you were supposed to recall, in experimental condition, you recall a time in the past where you gave, and then and there's some control task. And then the last one, which is maybe the most interesting way of doing this, they had samples in Canada and South Africa. They randomly assign people to 2 conditions, and in one of the conditions, they literally give them money to spend, and they say you have to spend it on charity or on other people, and in the control condition, you have to spend it on yourself. At the end of the study, they ask, how good do you feel? How happy do you feel about this? And people in the charity condition report feeling better at the end. So, really nice set of studies, and to maybe add some detail, I have a video actually of Ackman herself talking about her research. Okay, so really nice set of studies, and as she mentioned, really large sample with the correlational study. I think she said over 200,000 people, over 130 countries. So that's one line of evidence for a connection between well-being, and that would be more so, I suppose, in the hedonistic sense, just kind of reporting how good do you feel at the end of the day after giving to charity. Another line of evidence that the book briefly talks about has to do with physiological evidence. So when you engage in pro-social activity, we know something about the neurochemistry. It involves the release of oxytocin, which is associated also with the release of endorphins and other neurotransmitters associated with pleasure. So this is reason to think that we've been sort of hardwired by evolution to find being nice pleasurable, which makes sense given that we are social animals. So the fact that pro-social behavior involves oxytocin release, which leads to feeling good, is more evidence consistent with moral behavior being in some sense in one's own self-interest. However, the book does note that oxytocin release seems to be associated with a more parochial kind of morality. By parochial, I mean being nice to people that you know or people you're related to. So it's not the kind of thing that seems to be associated with a more universalist kind of morality. And this is consistent with what we'll see later from Joshua Green, who argues that our basic evolved moral intuitions are good for dealing with people that we know, because we've evolved to, basically to be nice to our family and to people with whom we have reciprocal relationships. But if we're trying to solve global moral problems, probably our intuitions are not so good. Yep.
Just clarification, did you say that oxytocin release is evidence of us being more self-interested or not self-interested?
Well, the way I would say it is, the fact that being nice triggers oxytocin, which is pleasurable, or which is associated with pleasurable experience, is evidence that being nice, at least to people close to you, is in one's own self-interest. It feels good at the neurological level. So those lines of evidence are more relevant to a hedonistic conception of one's self-interest. What if we are eudaimonists? What if we think that what's in our interest is what Aristotle says? Well, here the connection is in a way more straightforward. Remember, Aristotle says that part of our function is we are social creatures, right? And so a flourishing life involves acting out that function, or acting out the fact that we are designed to be social creatures. And so, yes, being nice to people is very important, of course, for facilitating social relationships, and therefore would be, for Aristotle, very central to his conception of well-being. Okay, so as I say, I don't have as much to say about chapter 4. One thing I'll say, actually, and actually this connects to the next chapter. There's a whole bunch of different words that have reason in it in chapter 4 and 5. I will explain them, including when they come up in chapter 5, and they may be needed to help you understand other terms, but I will be nice. None of the questions on the test have the word reason in it. So you should be able to cross out a good number then. So if it has the word reason in it, it's not on the test. Although, maybe keep it in mind because it might help you with other terms. But if to the extent they don't stress out about, I think there's there's quite a few. So, Merry Christmas.
Do you think about that? Just kidding.
Yep.
Are you gonna go over instrumental and intrinsic reasons?
So it's similar to something we saw in the egoism chapter. Instrumental reason means you have a reason to do something in virtue of what it gets you, not in virtue of the thing itself. So, you have a reason to get money. It's because it gets you other stuff. So we've made similar distinctions before, but like I said, those two won't be on the test. Yeah.
For that experiment, I'm wondering whether they give you the result because of the amount they're using is trivial. If they actually change it, for example, to 1 million or even 100,000, do you think the result will be totally different?
That's a good question. So as always in, this good scientific critical thinking, the effect may change depending on how large, some things in psychology are like this, right? Where it's not always a linear relationship. So it could be something like this, where, initially if you give money, it feels good when it's $20 or $100. If it's $1 million, maybe it might make you unhappy. That's perfectly possible. It would be more expensive to test your hypothesis, but you could test it.
And she did this through asking questions, right?
Yes, so that's another, I'm not sure if you're saying this is a reason to be skeptical, but yes, this is self-reported happiness. So it might be like, at the end it's like, yeah, I feel great after giving that money, but inside.
Yes, of course, I should do that. I want to look good.
Thank you for your honor. Although I will say,
That's social expectation. Yeah.
so it could be social desirability, but to be clear, this doesn't disprove that interpretation, they don't know that another group is being told to spend it on themselves. You're just given $20, say, hey, go give this $20 to someone. Then you call later, how you feeling? You don't know that it's being compared to people you don't know there's anyone who's getting the money for themselves. So that's one reason for maybe being skeptical, but it doesn't rule it out. I think your hand was up first, but.
She mentioned in the video that this was true across different financial spectrums. How far how detailed did they actually get?
That's a good question. So I don't know how many, groups they were explaining across. That's a good question. So you could do a master's thesis on it or something. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was also gonna say, they were given the money, I wonder if it was out of their own pocket, they would feel less good about having.
You're all very cynical. No, it's good scientific, critical thinking, but you're all like, what? People feel good giving money? It's impossible. There must be another explanation.
That was 2015, the economy's a bit tougher now, so.
I think things are different.
Yeah, things are different. Although she does look cross-culturally, including more impoverished countries. But no, I made a joke about it, but this is all good. It's good to be skeptical, even if it is motivated in some of you by a cynical view of human nature.
Something related to the key term groupishness?
Yeah, groupishness, I guess, connects with what I was saying about Aristotle, that humans are kind of naturally social species. And so if you think that well-being means living in accordance with your function, then being pro-social and nice and forming bonds, which you have to be somewhat moral to be able to do that, is in our self-interest. Yeah.
Also, just out of curiosity, because you talked about money a bit, are we gonna get into
You're not going to get money, no sir.
No. But I was talking the morality of having a shit ton of money kind of thing, or
We will talk about this exact thing with Peter Singer. It's, I think, one of the most uncomfortable arguments in this course. Spoiler alert, I think Peter is 100% right, even though none of us can live up to what Singer says. I mean, a little, just, I can tell today's lecture probably won't take as long. His argument is, imagine you're walking down, to school or whatever, and you have a very expensive suit, worth whatever, $1,000. And there's a drowning toddler in a shallow pond, and imagine they only have X number of seconds left before they die, and the only way to save them is to jump in and ruin your $1,000 suit. Do you have a duty to save the child? Or another way of saying it, would you be kind of a shitty person if you didn't save them? And most people say yes. Some of you may see where Peter's going to go with this. Well, we have disposable income. There are life-saving charities. This is the argument that he makes is we do in fact have a duty to spend much more than we do on life-saving charities. So it's an uncomfortable argument, but so yes, that's a long way of saying yeah, we will. Okay. So one term I missed that'll help me lead into the next reading. So what Acton was interested in studying in the Giving paper is the extent to which the connection between niceness or pro-social behavior and well-being is a psychological universal. So a psychological universal means something that's true of basically every culture. Right? It's not limited to one society. So back in the intro, you would have been exposed to the idea from Paul Ekman that facial expressions, at least for some emotions, are psychological universals. Right? So the famous study in Papua New Guinea where there was a tribe who had never seen a movie, never been exposed to Western culture. And you ask them, what kind of facial expression would you make if you saw an old friend, or if your child died, or if you're about to fight someone, and you get basically the same expressions you'd find anywhere else. The next reading, I'm not sure how to pronounce this person's last name, but it's a study of morally related cultural differences. So in particular, and now this is of course, somewhat overgeneralized, but at least to a first approximation, what some of the differences are between Western and indigenous cultures with regard to moral emotions. So it's an interesting reading. This is not a topic about which I'm an expert. The main author is an indigenous scholar, but there's some interesting connections here. So again, this is a case where, and this is more what cultural psychologists are interested in, a case where there's a cultural difference, not something that's necessarily universal. Although actually, we're at the hour point. Maybe that's a good place for a break. So let's take a little over 10. I'll start talking again at 1:40. Okay, everyone. Let's do the ethics of belonging reading. So as I say, this reading is about differences between Western and indigenous ways of experiencing certain moral emotions. It talks about three emotions. The first two are compassion and gratitude. I'm going to focus more on those because they're more distinctly moral emotions. It also talks a bit about awe. You can read that as well. But the way it characterizes indigenous ethics is in terms of what it calls an ethics of belonging. And it includes some different ideas under this umbrella. The key idea is that all living things are connected. That's sort of the core of it. And this includes us. We are sort of part of nature, part of an interconnected nature, and therefore we have duties to nature. And what the article says is, emotions like compassion and gratitude are universals. It's not that one culture has these emotions and one doesn't, but the way in which they are construed is different, depending on the culture in which you grow up. So, the key distinction is as follows. Let's start with compassion. In Western cultures, compassion is something that you are supposed to feel for other people, especially those who are vulnerable. So it's an emotion that is supposed to be directed towards people. And this is reflected in Western ethical systems. So one extreme example of this is Kant, who's maybe the paradigmatic Western philosopher. In Kant's ethics, only humans matter. We only have duties to other humans. Descartes had a similar view. I mean, Descartes said maybe we should be, nice to animals, but basically just to practice being nice to humans. If you're mean to animals, you'll develop bad habits, which will then make you mean to humans. But humans are the only ones that matter. Another important ethical system that we've already talked about is utilitarianism, which also developed in the West. This is a bit less anthropocentric, less human-focused. What utilitarians say, so Bentham was arguably the first utilitarian, he said that what matters is not whether someone can reason or whether they can talk, but whether they can suffer. So this means that any animal that can suffer matters morally. So that's going to be broader than humans. Yes?
Where did this philosophy come from? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Bentham, or utilitarianism.
Okay.
Yeah. So utilitarianism, which is another Western philosophy, says that anyone who can suffer matters. Because remember, what matters is maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. So I guess more broadly than suffering, any animal that's capable of conscious experience. But that's still not going to include things like plants. I mean, maybe if you're a certain kind of panpsychist, if you took my 3309 class, maybe plants are conscious, but probably not. So if you're a utilitarian, plants don't matter except insofar as they facilitate the well-being of animals that can suffer. So maybe you could say, don't cut down the trees because then the squirrel will get hungry and that will be bad for the squirrel. But the tree itself doesn't matter if you're a utilitarian. Now, by contrast, the article argues that if you have an ethic of belonging, you think that the whole environmental system matters. We are interconnected with nature and therefore have duties to nature, not just the parts of nature that can suffer. The article says something very similar about gratitude, where from a Western perspective, gratitude is, again, something you feel for other people or other agents. You're in a trading relationship or you get a gift or whatever, and you feel, thanks, buddy. You feel thankful for the thing you're given by another person. Whereas gratitude is something that is felt, again, towards the entire ecosystem. If you come at it from an indigenous ethic of belonging perspective. This is less relevant to the moral psych aspect, but this is something I talk about in Intro Psych too, how even the ways people think about themselves is more relational or more interconnected in non-Western cultures. So a simple task you can do, this is a real psychology test, is the I am test. How many of you done the 20 I am test? Well, I guess, wait, you were in my class. So you can do it, well, I guess I'm kind of going to spoil it a bit, but you write down as many statements as you can that begin with the words I am. And they have to be true, like you don't write I am Batman or something. 20 true statements about yourself that begin with the words I am. And what you find is people from non-Western cultures are more likely to have more relational statements. So statements like I am a brother, I am a cousin, I am a member of this group, and so on. Whereas people from Western cultures are more likely to have just statements about your own individual traits. Okay, so I use the Ackman reading as a springboard to do this reading because this reading is an example of cases where there are cultural differences. Any questions about that reading? Yep.
Did you give a definition for cultural psychology?
I mean, yeah, just broadly speaking, the study of how culture shapes how we think. Something really simple like that. Okay, next we will do chapter 5. And again, I'm going to use chapter 5 as a springboard to talk about other things. I don't have too much to say about the chapter itself. I'll start with the example the chapter starts with, which is the example of putting one's dog to sleep. The dog is sick and you decide to put it down. And when making a decision like that, people often say something like, I chose to do this, but I didn't want to. I see some people nodding. So this chapter centers around the views of someone named David Hume, who we've already talked about briefly. According to a certain reading of Hume, a sentence like that doesn't really make sense, or at least you have to add some caveats. The sentence being, I chose to do X, but I didn't want to. According to the view we're going to talk about, if you choose to do something, in some sense you had to have wanted to do it. There may be conflicting desires, so that's fine. So maybe, quote, part of you didn't want to, or you had a desire to, for the dog to continue to live, but you also had the desire the dog not suffer, and as evidenced in your behavior, that desire was stronger, or that desire won out. Okay, so I already mentioned that the words that have the term reason in it won't be on the test, but I'll quickly define the first three just so at least it's easier to read the chapter. It distinguishes practical reason or practical reasons, theoretical reason or theoretical reasons, and maybe reason with a capital R, or reason as an ability. And these are all legitimate senses of the term reason that we use in ordinary speech. It's just useful to keep them separate. So practical reasons are reasons for action, reasons for doing things. So this would actually include both prudential reasons and moral reasons. So when we say you have a reason to do this, that's under this broad umbrella, right? A reason to do. So, the fact that broccoli is high in vitamins is a reason to eat it. In that case, a prudential reason. The fact that face punching causes suffering is a reason to not do it. That would be a moral reason. We also speak of reasons to believe things. So the fact that there's hundreds of hominid fossils in a particular pattern is a reason to believe in the theory of evolution. The fact that there's a correlation between the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and temperature is a reason to accept climate models, whatever. So that falls under this umbrella. And we speak that way in everyday life, right? That this is a reason for X. But then we also sometimes speak of reason as a noun, right? So, humans have reason, worms don't. If we use it in that sense, we're speaking of reason as a kind of ability. There's actually some other senses of the term reason that come up later, but just wanted to start by distinguishing that. Okay, the main idea, as I said, in this chapter has to do with David Hume. I like Hume. Hume is definitely one of my favorites. He didn't get everything right, but a very important philosopher. Not only is he my namesake, he also is a fellow Scot, so I feel some affinity with Hume. One term we've already seen from him is the is-ought gap. So back in, I guess that would have been chapter 1, we talked about the idea that you can't derive normative or should-y statements from purely descriptive ones. That idea goes back to Hume. But we're now going to talk about the Humean theory of motivation, which the chapter sometimes just calls HTM. But I'm going to have to build up. There's a number of moving parts in the Humean theory of motivation, and we're going to, as I say, build our way up to it. The first key distinction is the one between belief and desire. And what I'm about to say will be review if you took Psych 3309 with me. These are two different types of mental states. Both of them involve some kind of relation between the mind and the world. Beliefs aim to represent the way the world is. So I'll say it again, but beliefs aim to represent the way the world is. When you have a belief, it means you think the world is a certain way. Desires are also representations of the world, but they represent the way you want the world to be, not the way you think it is. The simple example I use in 3309, suppose I'm sitting in my room and I'm cold. I look over and I see that the window is open. So my belief is the window is open. That's me, and I could be wrong, maybe I'm hallucinating or something, but the point is it's a representation I have, a mental representation of the way the world is. In this case, the world is such that the window is open. My desire is that the window be closed. So that's a picture of the world I have in which the window is closed. I want the world to be like that. And this is a useful way of explaining people's behavior, right? The way we behave is we try to move these together, right? We try to do things that make the world accord with our desire type thoughts. So this allows us to build up to the Humean theory of motivation. So there's 3 parts. Part 1 is essentially what I just said, that there's a certain conception of beliefs and desires, right, where both are representations of the world. One is a representation of the way the world is, the other is a representation of the way you want the world to be. Number 2, and this is the motivation part, desires are necessary to explain behavior. In other words, you can't explain behavior only through talking about people's beliefs. Beliefs, including reasoning about beliefs, can never get you to do something. In order to explain why people do things, you have to talk about what they want. So this is a provocative claim. I mean, Hume has a number of provocative claims in this kind of area, one of which is reason. And now reason is about beliefs, right? Reasoning, logic, that is what now allows you to change your beliefs. He says, reasoning is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Basically meaning, the slave of desires. He has a related quote that it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of your finger. So imagine, some genie comes to some psychopath and says, you have a choice. Option A, I will scratch your pinky. Option B, I destroy the world and kill everyone. What Hume is saying is, if the psychopath chooses the first option, yeah, just scratch my pinky. I don't, so scratch my pinky to prevent, everyone from dying. We may say we don't like the psychopath, but we can't say he's being irrational. He just has desires that we don't like. And you don't have to agree with that. There's, this is a controversial claim, but so if you want to explain why people do things, you have to talk about what they want.
Sorry, why do we not like the psychopath for getting his pinky scratched?
So maybe I could word it differently to get the point across. So I'm sure you're not a psychopath, but let's say that the genie comes to you and says, you have two choices. You either let me scratch your pinky and then everyone lives, or I kill everyone. And you basically say, like, I'll let everyone die to avoid getting my pinky scratched.
Oh, I see. I thought he was choosing getting the pinky scratched. Okay.
Yeah, so if I misspoke, if the psychopath lets everyone die, let's put it that way, we can say we don't like him, but he hasn't done anything irrational.
Right, gotcha.
If he just likes the thought of people dying and really cares about his pinky, there's nothing straightforwardly irrational about it. At least that's what Hume says. Okay, the next one, which really follows from that, is reason's internalism. So here there's more reason's words, although, as I say, those specific words may not be on the test, but it may help you with the Humean theory of motivation. So, motivating reasons have to do with desires, right? The desire you have that made you do what you did. So, if someone gives money to charity, there's all sorts of motivating reasons that they may have had. Maybe they wanted to impress a girl, maybe they felt guilty, maybe there's all sorts of different possibilities. So, but if we're asking about motivating reasons, we're asking, why did they do that? Normative reasons, which is actually pretty close to moral reasons that we already saw earlier, is, if we're asking about that, we're asking, should he have done it? Was it normatively or morally right that he do that?
Sorry.
You are forgiven. So reason's internalism is a fancy way of saying this. Normative reasons depend on motivating reasons. This is a conclusion I don't especially like, although, well, I shouldn't spoil the ending, but I think this is, broadly speaking, right. Actually, let me first define the opposite of this. So the opposite of this, so reason's externalism, is the view that, no, these are separate. Normative reasons, moral reasons, can be binding on you whether or not you care about them. And I think we want to believe that. We want to believe, at least I want to believe, that something like what Kant believed, that there are moral reasons for action whether or not you care about them. We want to be able to say to the psychopath, you should not have done that. It's true that you should not have done that, whether or not you personally care about it. Hume said he couldn't make sense of that, and he says, look, normative reasons are really just a special kind of motivating reasons. So, to be more concrete, an example of a normative reason for Hume would be something like this. If you care about the suffering of other people, then you shouldn't steal from them, hurt them, etc. If you don't care, if you have no motivation or no desire to help people, it's not as though there's some magical external duty that you have to help.
So,
Yep.
so he didn't believe in normative reasoning then?
He believed there are normative reasons, but they depend on motivating reasons. They're not separate from it. They're just a subtype of
So they're,
motivating reasons.
in his opinion, they're within motivating reason.
Exactly. Yeah. So I have an example of a video. This is a debate. Now, the topic of the debate is actually moral realism versus anti-realism, which is sort of similar to this debate, but yes?
Reasons, externalism, you said, is that that normative reasons do not depend on desires?
Yes.
Okay.
So externalism is the other view. So reasons externalism means, so this is now not a part of the Humean theory of motivation. Means there are normative or moral reasons for action that don't depend on what you want or what you happen to be motivated by. So if you want to say to the psychopath, you shouldn't lie, even if you really like it or don't care about being honest, we want to say, yeah, there's something to that. But Hume says, no, that doesn't make sense. So the video, as I say, is a debate. The topic is actually moral realism versus anti-realism, which is sort of similar to this debate. I'll be saying more about that in a bit, but this part is, I think, very much relevant to here. So one person in the debate, he's the one with the darker shirt and with the darker background. The debate was over Zoom. These are both philosophy professors. The person in the dark room in the dark shirt has said that he is a Humean. And he talks about why he does nice things. And he says, like, I don't really think about my life in terms of, am I abiding by these external moral duties? I help people because I care about them. So that's a very Humean way of talking. So I'll show that as a kind of illustration of this, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so as I say, that's very much in the spirit of this view of Hume's. So there's a few other things to say in this chapter, but as I say, that's really the core of it. Any questions about the basics of the Humean theory of motivation?
Direction of fit.
Good. Direction of fit relates to the belief and desire issue. So for beliefs, the direction of fit is mind to world, right? The mind is trying to map onto the world. For desire, the direction of fit is you're trying to get the world closer to what's in your mind. Yeah, so that's the idea. I'm quite sure that one's not on the test either, but it's helpful for distinguishing beliefs and desires. Another term from this chapter is cybernetics and or control theory. The basic idea here is thinking of systems in this way, in terms of having beliefs and desires, is a useful way of two things. It's a useful way of modeling how animals and humans work, but it's also a useful way of building robots or building control systems. Right? So if you want to build a robot that does stuff, you basically have to program in two kinds of states. Representational states that are kind of like beliefs that represent what the state of the world is, and goal states, which is more like desires. So the way the system, quote, wants the world to be. I mean, trivial, nice, simple example that, again, you would have heard in 3309 if you took it with me. Think of a thermostat, right? Maybe the simplest system you could build that has something like this. You could think of a thermostat as a control system with one belief and one desire. Its one belief is what's the temperature in the room right now. It has, measuring instruments that measure what the temperature is right now, and its one desire is to move the room to whatever temperature is pushed in. So it has to be constantly, measuring what the temperature is, and its actions, very simple actions, are moving the state of the world closer to its desired or goal state. So it's a really useful way of modeling and of building things. The book gives some other examples, but the core idea there should be pretty straightforward. And so the connection back to the example at the beginning of putting your animal down, right? If you're a human, in some sense it doesn't make sense to say, or at least it's incomplete to say, I did X but didn't desire to. Right? What's actually going on is you had competing desires, and the desire that the animal not suffer was a stronger desire. It's the one that won out.
So it is when you have more than one desire.
Yeah.
At the same time.
At the same time. I mean, look, here's another example. Some of you may be tempted to say when you're studying for this class, okay, I'm choosing to study, but I don't really want to. Well, again, if you're a Humean, what's true is I have competing desires. I have the desire to have a second dinner and watch Netflix, and I have the desire to do well in the course, and they are competing. And hopefully, hopefully one of them wins out, or hopefully the second one wins out. Okay, so as I say, so we're done with the textbook part of the course, or the course of the class today. That was fast. And I'm going to use it as a springboard to talk about a few readings.
Did you cover moral anti-realism and moral realism?
Yeah, so that's the springboardy part. So basically the rest of the class, not course, is about those two things. Although actually, I think maybe we'll take our second break a little earlier, because there's some more headachy stuff, potentially. So let's take maybe a shorter break, maybe just 5 minutes. So, and when we come back, we'll actually have a discussion topic pretty quickly. So I'll start talking again at like 2:16-ish. So take a walk, stretch your legs, and we'll talk about moral realism. All right, everyone. Okay, so the debate we're going to spend the rest of today talking about is the debate between moral realism and moral anti-realism. This is sort of similar to the internalism-externalism debate. Externalism would be closer to realism. So what do these two terms mean? So I'll start with moral realism. Moral realism, so the key word here is real. This is the view that there is such a thing as objective moral truths. And by objective, I mean something like mind independent. So if something is objectively true, that means it's true whether or not anyone believes it. So if you, again, took my 3309 class, there's a similar debate about scientific realism. Scientific realism is, I think, it enjoys much more consensus, but take something like the idea that the Earth, bless you, the idea that the Earth orbits the sun. It at least seems to be the case that that's objectively true. By which I mean, back when everyone believed the sun went around the Earth, well, they were just wrong, right? So the fact that the Earth goes around the sun seems to be something that's objectively true. It's true whether or not anyone believes it. A paradigm case of something that's probably not objectively true is like food preferences. Right? So take the claim, chocolate is tasty. It seems like, well, if everyone on Earth thought chocolate was disgusting, well, then it would be disgusting, right? The tastiness of something is mind dependent, right? It depends on how people respond to something, right? So in the case of, food preferences, obviously there's lots of disagreement. Some people like vanilla, some people like chocolate. And it doesn't seem like there's any way of showing that one side is right or wrong, right? The tastiness of something is dependent on how people respond or what people think about the thing. I mean, this is kind of an extreme example I sometimes use, but even something like, poop doesn't taste good. Some insects, right? If you do your business outside, the insects will, they disagree with us about poop. And again, it's not like we are right and insects are wrong about poop, right? Whether something is tasty or not is mind dependent. So, moral realism is the view that moral statements like lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, slavery is wrong, whatever your favorite moral judgment is, those are capable of being true or false in this objective sense. And this should have at least some intuitive appeal, right? So take a sensitive example, but something like slavery. Of course, there was a time in which the consensus in many societies was slavery is morally acceptable. And we want to say, well, they were just wrong. At least I feel the desire to say that was just wrong. So, as you might suspect, moral anti-realism is the view that moral statements are not capable of being true in that objective sense. There's going to be different versions of each, but one example of a moral anti-realist perspective is sometimes called the boo-hurrah theory. So the idea would be moral statements are just expressions of preference. So when I say stealing is wrong, I'm not saying something that is factually true or false. I'm basically just saying, boo, stealing. And when I say giving to charity is morally good, again, I'm not saying something that could be true or false. I'm basically just saying, yay or hurrah for giving to charity. Yep.
Does the idea of moral realism is it compared to the is-ought gap at all?
Yeah, so I would say that the is-ought gap is going to be a problem for some versions of moral realism, one that we'll see later. Yep.
Yeah, just like from watching topics on this in the past, they often talk about how the idea that we can't have any objective morality without the idea of a God, for example.
Yep.
So I imagine.
I'll talk about that very example. And it's not going to be a testable example, but many people say that in order for there to be moral facts or objective moral truths, there has to be a God. Now, personally, spoiler alert, I don't think moral realism makes sense whether there's a God or not, but maybe that's an aside. But yes, that kind of issue does come up with this debate.
I mean, just building off of that, isn't any realism prescribed by God, that God's definition of morality? So wouldn't that actually be moral anti-realism?
I would say that. Now, some people, of course, don't agree. This is philosophy. Everything's controversial. But I think if there really is a giant omnipotent being who issues moral commands, well, I may or may not like those commands. Right?
It's his subjective opinion.
It's just a very large subjective opinion. Now, many of you may not agree with that, and you're not required to agree with anything I say. Yeah.
Is it so? Moral anti-realism, that is like the opposite. Basically, it's dependent on mind.
Dependent on mind. Some will say depend on maybe multiple minds, like maybe culturally constructed, but it's not something that's objectively true. Now, I just want to soften it a bit. This doesn't mean you have to be anti-morality, right? You can still think morality is very important, even worth, risking life and limb for, but you just think it's a matter of preference or values. And they can be preferences you care a lot about, but they don't correspond to something objectively true. So, now I'm not a dogmatic person. I guess I showed my cards a little bit. I find that's more interesting personally. Some professors try to hold their cards close to their chest and just present both views, but I found it kind of interesting when the prof would give their opinion. But I will say I was a moral realist for most of my life, and I still kind of wish I believed it. So maybe one of you can talk me into it. Break into small groups and discuss these two, and some potential arguments for or against. Okay, so some groups are quieting down. Let's bring it back in. Okay, so wrap up your sentence. All right, so what are some thoughts that different groups came up with? Yep, sure.
Depends on what we are thinking about, what we are saying. For example, to harm a child, it's morally wrong, doesn't matter where you are. But in some countries, they have they can have more than one wife. But for us,
That's a bad idea
can't. So,
everywhere.
for them it's okay.
Yeah.
But for them it's okay. So they have, depends what we are saying about it, about moral. Depends.
Yes. So one view you could have, and it's a perfectly respectable view, is okay. Some things, some moral norms are just culturally dependent, and we should respect, different norms. So some cultures have polygamy, some don't. But maybe some things we want to be realistic about, like don't harm children. I mean, street, we'll talk about actually that very example, but that is one view you could have. Any other thoughts different groups had? Yep, yeah, sure.
I can kind of just piggyback off of that idea. I mean, we were talking about how there were some civilizations in the past that this already messed up. things.
Some what, sorry?
Civilizations, sorry.
Yeah.
So cannibal cultures,
Yep.
ritual sacrifices, that kind of thing. And so if morality is what they make it dependent on what their beliefs are, then that can go in a pretty concerning, straight direction.
Yeah, exactly. So I share that intuition. If something feels very off about saying, well, this culture practices child sacrifice, and I have to respect that because, there's no objective moral truth. So there's a very strong inclination to say, no, in some sense, those cultures are just wrong to do child sacrifice or whatever it is. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
If there was moral realism, wouldn't we all just be on the same page?
So one argument you could make, and there's pro and con you could make here. One thing you could say is, well, if there's moral realism, why isn't there more moral convergence? Why is there so much disagreement? Now, I'll play devil's advocate for the realist, and I'll say, well, the same is true in science. People often disagree about scientific theories. That doesn't mean there's no fact to the matter. It just means some scientists have the wrong theories, unlike me.
Most things that have been proven by science are really just the best guess.
Right.
The information we have.
The best guess. So, one thing is that some people are not realists even about science.
Yeah.
So there's also that option. But yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we were just talking most things I think are anti-realism.
Mm.
There has to be some kind of collection of agreement that
Yeah.
these things are right or wrong. And I think that it's hard to be objective. In fact, I don't really necessarily believe in complete objectivity about anything.
Right.
Because everyone has an experience, everyone has a different way of seeing the world. But, I think that any instance with context could change if something is objectively right or wrong. In the sense of the children, what if you had a group of children that were running around murdering people? Well, we should probably punish them or do something to stop them.
Right.
So
Hopefully not.
there's,
Hopefully not child sacrifice and take.
I'm not saying child sacrifice. I'm not saying child
I know you're
sacrifice. But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Very messy, context dependent, and then it becomes difficult, given how messy and context dependent it is, to say there's one objective truth.
Right.
Yep. So these are all interesting considerations. So one of the readings is Tiberius. That's actually the Tiberius 2014 reading. It's actually just an older edition of this book. She used to have a section on this, and she cut it out. And I was like, well, why? It's a good explanation. So that's all that is. But a lot of that section is really just summarizing the reading after that, which is Sharon Street. This is one of the most influential arguments in this area. Street draws on evolutionary considerations to, I think she's careful. She's not saying it disproves moral realism, but it should make us skeptical about moral realism. Although there's a good amount of build-up we have to do before we get to her argument. So the Sharon Street reading starts off with some punchy sentences. Life is preferable to death. Health is better than sickness. We should care for children, not harm them. altruists should be admired rather than condemned. Cheaters should be punished, not rewarded. And you could maybe add, happiness is better than suffering, right? So what she says is, these statements strike us with great emotional force, right? Something seems very compelling about them. And what we therefore are tempted to conclude is they must just be true. Bang the table, right? It's just true that, for example, we shouldn't harm children or what have you. And Street's going to problematize that view. And her argument falls under the umbrella of what are called genealogical arguments. Genealogical meaning having to do with the origin or the cause of someone's beliefs. So when you study what caused someone's beliefs, or indeed it could be your own beliefs, you study what caused your beliefs, this may cause you to have less or more confidence in that belief. So if it's an undermining genealogy, that means the story about what caused your belief causes you to have less confidence in that belief. The Tiberius reading calls this a debunking argument. That's the same thing. So here's an example. Suppose there's someone who, I think the example she uses is, you ask someone, who was the 15th president of the United States? And they think about it and they say, Rutherford B. Hayes. And then you show them a videotape which shows that they were actually just hypnotized to believe that 10 minutes earlier and then had their memory wiped of it. Then they think about it and they go, okay, I'm not so confident anymore that Rutherford B. Hayes was the 15th president. So this is a story about what caused them to say that, in this case, hypnosis. And given that that's what caused them to believe it, they learn that and they go, okay, I'm not so confident this is true anymore. Now we have to be careful. This kind of argument does not show that the belief is false. It just shows you should be less confident. If you go from a story about the genealogy or the origin of beliefs straight to the belief is false, that's actually a fallacy, which has a name. It's called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy means you learn about what caused someone's belief, and it's some undermining type of cause or genealogy, and your conclusion is the belief is false or not true. So that's fallacious. Here's an example. Suppose that someone believes the earth is round, but you do a little personal history, and it turns out the only reason they believe the earth is round is they read it in a Spider-Man comic book. That does not show the belief is false, right? So, but what it does show is that person should, when he thinks, why do I believe that? And that's the only reason he believes that. He has no other scientific training or education, let's say. He should be less confident in his belief, right? So that's what this kind of argument does. It doesn't show for sure the belief is false, but it should reduce one's confidence. By contrast, a vindicating genealogy is a story about what caused someone's beliefs that should make them more confident that it's true. So I think the example she uses is, you're walking down the street and you see someone and you think, this person seems dangerous. Not quite sure why, I just have a hunch. And then later you remember that you saw that face on America's Most Wanted or something. You saw them on a credible television program. You think, okay, that was, my suspicion was justified. The fact that it was caused by a news report is reason to be more confident in my mistrust of the person. So that's just some basics of what these kinds of arguments are like. And most of the reading is about the first kind, so like the cases where learning about what caused someone's belief makes you less confident that it's true. And what Street draws on to make this argument, as I said earlier, is evolution. Street in this article assumes that our basic moral intuitions, or what she calls basic evaluative tendencies, evaluative just meaning you think some things have value. So like it's good to care for kids, it's bad to cheat, it's good to be altruistic, and so on. So not the cultural details of all the things we overlay on top of that, but the kind of core moral intuitions that are cross-culturally universal. And she sketches a kind of evolutionary story about how those kinds of tendencies evolved. And we've seen some of those stories already, right? Back in chapter 2, we talked about things like kin selection and reciprocal altruism, maybe group selection, some basic evolutionary processes that lead to us having these basic moral intuitions. And what she asks is, well, is this an undermining genealogy or a vindicating one? And she says it kind of depends. It depends on what your conception of value is. So it depends on what your meta-ethics is. So meta-ethics just means the kinds of debates related to realism and anti-realism. It's about not specific debates like is this wrong or is this wrong, but what does it mean to say things are right or wrong? Are those just expressions of preference, or do they correspond to some kind of objective truth? So you could have a mind-independent conception of value. That's, like we said earlier, that's moral realism. Or you could have a mind-dependent conception of value, which is an example of anti-realism. So if you have a mind-dependent conception of value, when we say things like it's good to care for kids, that's basically a fancy way of saying we like caring for kids, or we prefer caring for kids. And it might be a very, 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 very strong preference, but it's still, on this conception, just a preference that we have. And what Street says is if you have the first conception of value, evolution is a big problem. And here's why. So what evolution produces is adaptations. Right? Adaptations are traits that exist because they conferred a benefit on the organism. Right? So think of white fur. Right? Animals in a snowy environment. If you're in a snowy environment, genes for white fur mean you're going to live longer. So if there's two bear cubs, one has a white fur gene and one has a brown fur gene, the white fur bear is going to be harder to see by the prey animals, so he's going to eat more, he's going to live longer and have more time to have fun with the female bears, and then we'll have more descendants. Keep that going forward many generations. Eventually, all the bears in the snowy area are going to have the white fur gene. Right? So this includes our kind of basic cognitive capacities, our capacities to think about the world. And in the case of our beliefs about the physical world, that would be, I guess I shouldn't have erased this, but that would be a vindicating genealogy. So we have the ability to reason and think about the physical world, right? To form beliefs about what's in front of us. And to put it really simply, if you have the ability to see and to believe that there is a lion in front of you and to be right about it, that is very good for your survival and reproduction, right? Anyone who couldn't represent that there was a lion present and get it right most of the time, we are not the descendants of those people, for obvious reasons. So when it comes to our beliefs about the physical world, evolution is a kind of vindicating genealogy. But let's think about this. Suppose, let's just say, for the sake of argument, pretend there really are these mind-independent moral truths. Let's say it's just objectively true, like in Plato's heaven, Plato thought there was like this heavenly realm of mathematical and moral truths and things like that. Let's say that in Plato's heaven, it's just wrong to lie. Objectively so. What difference would that make to our survival and reproduction? How could that exert selection pressure on who has babies and who doesn't? And it seems like there's no way it could, right? There's no way for these kind of mind-independent, objective moral truths to exert selection pressure on who spreads their genes and who doesn't. And so therefore, we have no reason to believe that our basic moral intuitions correspond to these objective moral truths, even if there are any. So, I mean, that's the core of it. That's basically Street's argument. Does this argument make sense?
So could you one more time explain the difference between the undermining and vindication?
For sure. So an undermining genealogy, and this doesn't just have to be evolution, it could be other things too. It's a story about what caused your beliefs. So that's a genealogy. A genealogy in this context just means a story about what caused your belief. An undermining genealogy means it's a story that makes you less confident in those beliefs. So, like the hypnosis case, if you found out that a belief of yours was caused by hypnosis, you would say, I'm not so sure about this belief anymore. Now I'm going to have to second guess this. Whereas a vindicating genealogy means it's a story about what caused your belief that makes you more confident that it's true. And when it comes to our beliefs about the physical world, Street says evolution is a vindicating genealogy, because evolution has a means by which beliefs about the physical world can be relevant for survival, right? Like I said, if you're able to believe that there's a lion there, that's really helpful, right, for not dying before you make babies. Whereas beliefs that, about moral facts, it doesn't seem like there's any way that the objective moral facts could exert selection pressure, even if there are these mind-independent moral facts. So again, as I always say, this is not a class to convert you to believe in things. You don't have to agree with the argument, but does the kind of logic of the argument make sense? Some nods. I'll take it.
So, going back to like saying lying is always wrong, we're saying that like how could that possibly be like adaptation? Like how could that possibly
So more so, like how could the mind independent, here's what could be true. It could be true, and it probably is true, that believing lying is wrong is good for your survival and reproduction, right? Having these kinds of moral intuitions is probably good for social cooperation. But if we think of moral truths, like moral statements like lying is wrong, as being mind independent, these kind of objective truths, those could not exert selection pressure. And so even if they exist, there's no reason to think our evolved moral intuitions correspond to these.
You saying they cannot exert selection pressure, as in like they do not improve like fitness, or they cannot get
the lion can exert selection pressure. If you can't figure out the lion's there, you're lunch. If in Plato's heaven, now saying in Plato's heaven is a little silly, but if there really is this truth that lying is wrong, objectively wrong, how can that prevent some people from spreading their genes or not? And it seems like there's no way it could.
Could you not like surmise for the mind independent value that perhaps, who knows, maybe in the past there have been societies who, through religion or just through their own moral musings, that following these 10 commandments actually improves fitness overall because we all agree to be cooperative and help each other, and that carries our genes for the future over the guys who don't play nice in that society over there.
I'm not sure I understand the connection to the argument. So what it might mean, so maybe I'll try and repeat it maybe in ways I can understand. So something like, the 10 Commandments, maybe, or these kinds of moral norms are objectively true, and they increase survival and reproduction. I guess what I'd be inclined to say, it's a giant coincidence. That
Yeah.
it just so happens that what's useful for survival and reproduction is also what's true in Plato's heaven. And I should say too, and maybe this is also relevant, different species evolve very different sorts of intuitions. And you really have to be saying is, in the specific case of human evolution, what was good for our survival and reproduction happened to be what's objectively morally true. Because if you're a lion, this is kind of depressing, but when a new male lion takes over a pride, he kills all of the cubs from the previous male so that he can spread his genes. So the lions got those moral intuitions, we got different ones. Maybe we got really lucky and happened to be in the one species that has social mammals. We're in or social primates. We're in the branch that has the right moral intuitions, but it seemed to be a giant coincidence. Yeah.
I was just gonna add to that. Wouldn't that just be like something that mind independent that everybody agreed mind dependently to adhere to? So like you said, a coincidence?
Yeah.
You said like 10 commandments are objectively true, but you still need everybody to mind independently agree to follow them.
Yeah, so I could steelman the realist. I think the realist can say there are mind-independent truths, but in order for them to have any effect, we have to agree on them.
Yeah.
We're getting into deep weeds here, but I mean that's the point of the course, I guess.
I was just a thought.
Yeah, just a thought. No, I know what you're getting at. Okay, so that's the street reading. Now, what she says, though, is, a mind-dependent conception of value is safe from this kind of argument. If you think that the language of saying this is good or bad or right or wrong is really a fancy way of talking about what you want or what you value, then that kind of conception, she says, is safe from this kind of argument. Oh, I was going to say something earlier, but I guess I'll say it now. So, one of the reasons I got originally interested in this debate, and this is, as I say, something that's not testable. So someone mentioned religion or the idea of God. So there's an argument in philosophy called the moral argument for the existence of God. So someone was, I think, kind of gesturing at this. And it goes something like this. If what?
If that, then which can.
Wait, what? No, I'm not going to list all. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral truths. Right? So, in other words, if the world is just atoms in the void, if there is no supernatural source of morality, then there are no objective moral truths. Premise 2, there are objective moral truths. And that second premise, at least initially, seems very intuitively appealing. Like we really want to say some things are just objectively wrong. And so the conclusion, by the rules of deductive logic, is there is a God, or God exists. I'll just write God. So that's deductively valid. The two premises do support the conclusion. The question is, are the two premises true? And I guess the street reading is targeted at premise 2. Street's argument is that there in fact are not, or at least we should be less confident that there are objective moral truths. The other reading is in a way targeted at premise 1. So it's a reading from someone named Sam Harris. And the textbook actually mentions Harris. So Harris was part of a group called the Four Horsemen of Atheism, kind of a funny name. So, I had my phase as a good Christian boy. That's how I was raised. But I also had a Sam Harris phase after. Him and I then broke up for various reasons. But and the reading I have from him is very much targeted at this first premise. So Harris tried to argue for a conception of objective morality that doesn't depend on anything supernatural, and it connects to some interesting issues in this course. So for the rest of today, we'll be talking a bit about his argument. It's useful to think of Harris as a kind of utilitarian. He doesn't like that word, but essentially it's a version of utilitarianism. And I'll actually just start by showing a video of him. So this is a TED Talk he gave. I'll skip it, so we won't watch most of it, but you'll get the basic idea from him. Okay, so I'll stop it there. So very forcefully argued, and so as I said at the beginning, this is Harris's attempt to argue that there are such things as objective moral truths. In his case, he's concerned about arguing that they can be independent of a religious foundation. And so to recap, if you're watching this later, the basic argument is there are truths to be known about what kinds of actions and what kinds of societal norms contribute to human well-being. And we can know that through sciences like psychology and economics. Once we figure out as we increasingly figure out what sorts of behaviors contribute to human well-being, those are the kinds that we morally should do. Now, based on prior chapters, you should probably be able to guess where, say, the textbook would object to something like that. What does this fall afoul of or violate from earlier in the course? You said it earlier. The is-ought gap, right. So this is a common critique of Harris, and like I said, I had my Sam Harris phase, but just as a purely logical matter, this does violate the is-ought gap. Now, it's perfectly fine for Harris to say, fine, my one assumption I'm going to make is you should do what maximizes well-being, but that's not a premise that science or factual investigation can establish, right? You can't do a bunch of science to find out that we morally should increase well-being. Look, the idea that we should increase well-being is an assumption that, of course, I share, but it's not one that you get from science. Harris is a little bit sneaky on this point. So the subtitle of his book is something like how science can determine human values or how science can determine morality. When he's pushed on this point, he will say, well, I mean science in a very broad sense, to include reason generally or something. Okay, fine, in that, in a rather trivial sense, maybe he's right. But if you include it so broadly as to include any human reasoning, then it kind of loses its juiciness. I won't show the video because we're running a little low on time, but the videos doc is included in Blackboard. If you look at there's a video, it's called the Earp video, Brian Earp, who someone will see later. There's a really good video of Brian Earp, who was a graduate student at the time. Total aside, Brian Earp's CV is immensely depressing. If any of you are planning on going on into the field, he publishes like an article every day. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's just, the man never sleeps. But back when he was a graduate student, he put this very point to Harris. He's like, well, you're presenting the argument as if you're doing something really radical and interesting, which is finding a way for science to establish what's right or wrong. But then when you're pushed, you kind of redefine it in this broad sense. And Harris's answer, I think, is pretty weak. And for me, I mean, the core reason I gave this up, it goes back to Hume, right? So remember, Hume says it's not irrational to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger. I mean, here's one way of making the point. Imagine there's two worlds, world A and world B. And by world, I mean, two possible states of affairs, two possible ways the world could be. And maybe you present this to, I don't know, God or something. God takes a psychopath out of the world and says, I will make the world whichever way you want. World A, everyone is very happy. World B is, as Harris says, the worst suffering for everyone. Or maximal suffering for everyone. And God says to the psychopath, which world would you prefer I create or instantiate? And the psychopath says, I like world B. Create that. What I think is just right is, and so I of course would object and say, no, Mr. Psychopath, don't do that. But it's not clear to me anyways that we disagree on any facts, right? We could agree on all the facts about what this world would entail, but still differ in what we say should happen. And at least in my current view, there's no straightforwardly rational way of settling a disagreement like that. Again, if someone is a complete psychopath and just doesn't care about the suffering of others. Now, I want to sweeten the pill a little bit because I think this is a rather unwelcome conclusion. And again, it's not one you have to share, but if you go down this road and decide that moral anti-realism is more likely to be correct, there were two things that really worried me about it, but that I think need not worry us. One relates to some of the examples you all brought up about, child sacrifice. I mean, the one that, we think a lot about in the West is the case of, like crimes in the 20th century, right? Like the Nazis, right? We want to be able to say, shake fist, the Nazis were just wrong. I'm not going to be a relativist about the Nazis and say, well, they have their morality, I have my morality. But I think this is not a legitimate worry for the following reason. Sure, maybe it's true that in some objective sense, we can't say the Nazis were wrong, but we can say, I hate the Nazis. I don't like human suffering, and be perfectly motivated to, land at Normandy or whatever it was, and fight that. So it doesn't mean we have to tolerate other moral views. I can say, I and we hate that. And maybe my hatred isn't grounded in some platonic heavenly truth, but oh well, no one promised you a rose garden. So in other words, I don't think that moral anti-realism means we have to accept all other value systems. The other worry I have, which we'll talk a lot about this at various points in the rest of the course, is there can still be a role for reasoning. It's not the kind of reasoning that we do in science where we're trying to get to the truth. It's closer to something like negotiation. Given that we have lots of shared moral intuitions, at least 99% of us do who aren't psychopaths. Okay, so we put the psychopaths away if they hurt people. The rest of us have enough, I think, moral intuitions in common that we can reason about them and negotiate about them. Even if they don't maybe correspond to anything objectively true, there's still a kind of reasoning that we can engage in. And I mean, I've already said a bit about what that reasoning looks like. It's basically reflective equilibrium. And maybe we do that not just individually, but collectively. So those are some things I wanted to say to kind of sweeten the pill. I'll be nice. There are some other terms in the Harris section. And look, Harris is a smart guy. He makes some, I think, interesting points in the reading I have listed. None of them will appear on the test except for one, moral landscape. So there will be a term on the test where I want you to kind of summarize Harris's position, where, again, broadly speaking, the idea of the moral landscape, as he said in that video, is there's a range of kind of peaks and valleys, by which he means different heights of well-being and low points of suffering that we can have collectively. So a peak might be, a well-functioning society where everyone is happy and cooperative. A low point would be like a failed state, or some other state of affairs in which people suffer a lot. And there are facts about which kinds of behaviors are more likely to get us up to a peak or down to a low point. And in his view, morality is basically about, figuring out and doing the kinds of behaviors that lead to peaks. And I do think it's an interesting and compelling way of thinking about it. There's definitely something to it. The objection I've been kind of making is I don't think science can show us that we should think about it this way or we should care about being on the peaks. That's a value judgment, at least I would argue that. Okay. So I think that's all I have to say for today. Any last questions about the Harris reading or anything else we covered today? So a couple reminders. So next week we'll build a bit more on this and talk a bit about moral psychology and religion. Not so much about the philosophical debates, but some empirical work about religious people and moral judgment. And then we'll get into chapter 6, which is on emotion and moral judgment. The other reminder, just make sure you submit some thoughts on the discussion topic at the beginning, like the experience machine, in the next 15 minutes if you haven't done so already. Stick around if you have more questions. See you next week.